Well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Ife Tayo Harvey, and thank you for joining Drugs, Alcohol, and Culture, where where Mezcal, Cannabis, and Psilocybin meet. I'm with the People of Color Psychedelic Collective, and I'm so grateful to be here with my friend Fabiola Santiago. Before we get into the discussion, I like to get some logistics sorted. So we do have Spanish translation available. If you go to the interpretation button at the bottom and click Spanish, our lovely colleague Daniel Garcia is doing the Spanish translation. And because of that, we will be speaking a little bit slower than normal. This conversation will be recorded, and after some post-production editing, we'll upload it to our YouTube channel for the public in a few months. We will have a Q&A portion, so feel free to chat in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as we go through the discussion. If you need help with anything, if you're having issues with Zoom, please directly message Liz Humphrey. She's on the panelist list. She is managing our Zoom, all of our tech stuff. So private message her if you run into any issues, and she will help you get them sorted out. And let's see, I think that's it for logistics. And feel free to chat in where you're listening from. We love to know where everyone's at, so let us know in the chat. Again, my name is Ife Tayo Harvey. I am the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. I got into drug policy reform work back in 2013, working with the Drug Policy Alliance, sharing my experience of growing up with my father in prison and deported. So I've been doing this work for a little minute now. I got into psychedelic work after my work at MAPS and learning about the healing potentials and use psychedelics to help heal parts of myself. So I'm very thankful to be here with all you guys and the organization that we've been working to build for a few years now. And this event is an interesting one. Fabiola and I met back in Oakland in 2019. I was speaking at the Women's Visionary Congress, and our friend Daniel Schumacher of THC Staffing introduced us because she thought we would be good friends. And ever since then, we've been good friends. But obviously we have some common threads in our friendship, which we'll talk about today. Initially, we bonded over soap making. We both make cold processed soap. And during the pandemic, we started, sharing soap making tips and sending each other soap in the mail. So yeah, and then now we're talking about drugs. So here we are. So I want to hand it over to Fabiola to introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, and how our worlds collided.
Yes, thank you, Ife, and hello, everyone. I love that people are calling from all sorts of places, so thank you for being here. It's really exciting to have this conversation. I actually would like to start by doing a little bit of a disclaimer that anything that I share here is from my personal experiences. I'm not in like the psychedelics industry or the mezcal industry. I am a person with lived experiences who has come across these industries and who comes of a culture of a people who have safeguarded and have had traditions around some of these substances. So that's number one. I also really want to encourage folks to take care of themselves, get your water, get your tea, get your food, snack. I think this is going to be, it's pretty free flowing. We'll have like at least 60 minutes. If it goes a little bit over because the conversation is really good, then we're open to that. So get comfortable. And then the third thing is, if there's anything that comes up that I say or that Aoife says that, makes you uncomfortable, please like check in with that. And, that's kind of an extension of taking care of your needs. And I'm going to slow down because I am speaking a little fast. So yeah, just wanted to start with that. And let's see, Ife already shared that we met through a mutual friend and our common interest in cold process soap making. And then we realized during our friendship that there's actually areas where we have some overlapping experiences. Me personally, I was undocumented for about 21 years. And the reason why my family had to migrate was actually largely due because of the mezcal industry plummeting in the 80s in Oaxaca. And that in itself was an effect of the tequila industry's growth. So we may get into that a little bit more, but I just wanted to name that. And because I was undocumented, the opportunities for higher education were really scarce and really difficult. So I kind of committed to working more on immigrant rights issues and movement. However, that is really taxing and was really taxing work and sometimes re-traumatizing. So instead, I chose to take a public health route and look at the ways that we can center our health and the health of marginalized communities. So I've done more of like systems thinking approach to social change. And using an intersectional lens to look at issues that we have in society. So that's kind of the work that I've done for the last 15 years. And when I finally got my green card in 2013, which was 9 years ago, I went back to Oaxaca. I booked a flight within the first week. And when I went back, that's when I was like, oh, that's right. Besides being undocumented, I'm also from Oaxaca, which is part of my identity that I have just kind of like put aside. And that matters because even within the Mexican identity, Oaxacan folks experience a lot of discrimination and shaming. So I think that experience opened me up to kind of like peel more layers around my identity, around indigeneity, and also because of the systems and intersectional work, understand like what is happening here with cultural appropriation and the mezcal industry and everything else. So that's kind of like a really brief summary of the trajectory so far.
Something that kind of leads into my first discussion point, and talking and thinking about all the people we bring with us when we enter a space, right? And all the experiences and memories, our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors, and their stories as well, we carry with us when we enter all types of spaces. So you shared a little bit about, what motivates you and the work that you do, but can you say a bit more about your trajectory, how you got known as a cultural worker?
Yeah, so when you're asking this question, I'm actually reminded of something that I hadn't thought about that. And we should probably let like folks know who are here that some of this is going to be really organic. Like Ifetayo and I have had extensive conversations about these topics. So whatever is meant to come out will come out. But I'm actually reminded of this time when I was in grad school and I was taking public health, and I was taking a folk medicine class, and it was taught by a white woman. And I was reading, as this was for the first class, reading the syllabus. And as I was reading that, I started feeling so annoyed and angry and thinking my mom or my grandma can be teaching this class. And the way that it was framed, it's as if it's very othered, it's very academic-y, it's very like objectifies a culture. And there I was sitting and undocumented, because I was still undocumented in grad school, experiencing, I was in removal proceedings. My mom at this point had already been deported, and like here I was like not doing well mentally, but still like just staying in academia because I need that receipt. And being taught by a white woman who had no connection to the culture, teaching about a culture. And I think that's how a lot of people learn about curanderismo, or not a lot, but that's one of the entry points, right? Is through academia. So I feel like I'm not answering your question though, because, well, that was part of the trajectory. That's what I was reminded of when you were asking that question. But I think it was that. And then like, you know, going to Oaxaca and thinking more about my identity. And I guess because at the time, what I was thinking earlier is I was so focused on fighting like for immigrant rights and, you know, getting that status. That became the focus. But as I took the time to kind of like peel some of the layers and identify the ways that the systems interact with each other, right? And like this need to be the good immigrant, like go to school, get good grades, follow the law, and the fear of being a bad immigrant. And also recognizing that the good and the bad immigrant are inherently anti-Black in the ways that like laws are written and policies are written, so that we internalize, you know, how we want to be perceived by other people. And as I had many privileges that allowed me to navigate these systems and adjust. And at the same time, and it was really uncomfortable. So saying all that, because I've taken advantage of those opportunities and I recognize, you know, the privileges whenever I remember. And I also know that it's been really uncomfortable. And for me, like we're just never doing enough work to really get at the core and at the root causes of a lot of issues. So this idea of like the cultural worker, which, you know, I still feel uncomfortable with titles, but it is what it is. That's the times we live in. We need to like have a title and some labels around our names. Is more because I can't stay quiet. Like I've known of like the stuff that's happening in the mezcal industry, like the commodification and the appropriation, and I've just ignored it. But it's just getting to the point where the appropriation is so bad that the way that I'm seeing it is that it's like indigenous erasure, right? The way that mezcal is being presented is through a white lens. The introduction, the place where it's introduced is at a restaurant or a bar and not with community necessarily. So what's happening by extension is that we're erasing the people's narrative. And so as someone who has been really committed, and it may be my like astrological thing, right? I'm like, I like justice. I'm like, what is it? Libra moon or whatever. I'm learning about that stuff.
Yeah.
I just know in my body that when I see injustices and because I've also experienced them, it just pisses me off. And it gets to a point where I just can't stay quiet. And like the quietness is actually more uncomfortable. So, you know, I just kind of share my thoughts mostly online on IG, on Instagram, but also with people in conversations, and people are like, oh yeah, that's like, I hadn't thought about that. So I'm like, okay, fine. I guess you can call me a cultural worker or whatever. But yeah, at the core of it, there is a want and a desire to like protect that which is, this word gets overused, but that which is sacred to me and my family, and for them to be like, for us to have those narratives live and exist in the world.
Yeah, definitely leaving evidence. And I see part of why I think this conversation is so interesting is, you know, you mentioned indigenous erasure, right? And that's something that we're seeing in psychedelics too, with like mushrooms, ayahuasca, you know, the list goes on and on. So I want to circle back to that, but I also want to say that the point you made about the good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative is definitely something that I relate to, you know, because my father was incarcerated and deported, and growing up, I had a lot of shame around that because there's already a lot of stigma around being in prison, but then being an immigrant on top of that, there's, you know, like you said, there's this like white supremacist narrative where people are like, oh, you're coming to this country, you need to, act right, when it's like, this isn't even y'all's country to begin with. Who are you? Y'all are the original bad immigrants. Let's just be real about that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of internalized shame and stigma that our people take on. And I was talking to one of my friends a few weeks ago, and she's white, but she's Jewish, and she was saying that assimilation is people pleasing on a larger scale. And so that has got me thinking about how so many of us internalize shame in so many different ways, not only as immigrants, but also drug users, formerly incarcerated people, currently incarcerated people. And that was really my motivation for getting into this work, because even as a kid, I always felt like my father should not be in prison for selling drugs. Like, in my eyes, I was always like, oh, well, if people want to use drugs, they should use drugs. And that's still my position, right? And I know for some people that might seem controversial, but a lot of us have been taught a false narrative that drugs are super dangerous, and if you use them, you'll get addicted. But a lot of times, most people, people don't get addicted to drugs, but a lot of times people who do get addicted are treating their own trauma, because our system lacks so much, but we also lack care systems for people who are dealing with trauma. I've heard of so many stories of people, start using drugs when they were in a vulnerable time in their life. So I say all that to say that, a lot of us have been duped in regards to like immigration, drug laws, all that stuff. But I want to circle back to what you were talking about with Mezcal, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit with our audience about, coming from a family of mezcaleros, but also like how you've seen that transformation since you first left Oaxaca. What are you experiencing now? I know you get approached by a lot of people in the industry for your wisdom and knowledge, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. So my first memory with mezcal was actually at a healing ceremony, a susto ceremony in Oaxaca, which is really common. And so till this day, for me, mezcal is medicine first. And again, I feel like because of the wellness industry and like all these other industries that have co-opted these terms, like food is medicine, like mezcal is medicine, I feel like it's losing its meaning, sadly. But that's what it is, for me and for my family. So it's something that we use in ceremony, in transitions, in celebrations. And it remains that way until it got its denomination of origin, pardon, in 1994. And it's been introduced here in the United States at bars and restaurants. So it's become something that people consume very comfortably, like whenever they feel like, drinking it, and not so much for like an intention or a purpose, which is fine, because we also use it for social reasons, for socializing. But the problem has become, at least, for me, is that a lot of the mezcal that isn't available in the US is not owned by producing families. It's owned by foreigners, it's people who are not of the culture. So they get to decide how to brand it, how to present it, where it exists, all that kind of stuff. And I do get hit up by people a lot about that. And I'll say that when I went in 2013 for the first time, there weren't as many agave fields to make mezcal, specifically the agave maguey espadin, which is agave angustifolia. And now it's just like on my way home, like, from the airport to my parents' town, which is around, or my town too, because that's where I'm from. it's about an hour, and it's just like feel like monocrops of like the same agave, and I'm just like, for tourists it's just like, wow, this is like amazing. For someone that's from there, I'm like, oh, this is awful. This is really bad. It's
Mm,
a monoculture of these plants, and people don't really think of like the long-term impacts that it could have on the community,
mm,
and the environment, of course, right? And yeah, people do hit me up, and I don't under it's really hard to navigate, because I think that the industry is not going away. It's not going away. It's growing. And I think I've been trying to sit more with like, well, what is the thing that we can do, or that I can do, um, to still live in integrity while this industry is growing,
mhm,
knowing that what is happening is probably going to lead to more forced migration, because people won't have the natural resources that they need in order to survive in our hometowns, right? And what is like the opportunity to have more discourse around immigration here in the United States, and for people here to take responsibility when that influx happens again, because it will.
mhm,
So that's kind of where my focus has been more on.
mm. Yeah, and this kind of touches on something we've talked about before with gentrification on a global scale. We've talked about our family's home countries. My father's from Jamaica, and your family's from Oaxaca, and we've talked about how they're like these expat communities or settlements, whatever you want to call them, forming, especially in Oaxaca. I mean, Jamaica is a little bit different. Jamaica's a lot smaller. It's an island country. And so it's a different ball game there, right? And Jamaica's tourist infrastructure dates back, it's pretty established. So I agree, like you said, it's very hard to make a dent in working against the industry. um so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about like these communities that you've seen in popping up in Oaxaca, um your thoughts on them, how they impact folks who are from there.
Yeah. Oh, the tourism industry. So I feel like it's more prevalent in the city, and I don't frequent the city. I have, I think, a little bit more in the last couple of years when I've been there. But other than that, I've just every time I visited Oaxaca, it's to be in like the pueblo where my parents are from and just stay there. Like I don't need to be like in the city to eat at certain places or tours. Like I think people. The other thing that people hit me up about is like, what do you recommend? I'm like, I don't know. I just go home and hang out with my family and like in the pueblo. Like I don't have food recommendations. I don't have spot recommendations, kind of
Mhm.
stuff. So that's like one piece. Um, but as I have been going back more, yes, there's like, first of all, they're not expats. They're still immigrants, like they're migrants. I just and I first learned the word expat when I traveled Southeast Asia like 5 years ago, and everyone was introduced, not everyone, but like some folks were introducing themselves as expats, and I had to look that word up. I'm like, what is an expat? I'm like, this is an immigrant. I'm like, how come they get a different term than those of us who like migrate to of a different nationality, or of racialized people get don't get to call ourselves expats. I'm like, well, I guess my family's an expat in the US then. um but yeah, they stay there, and I think they just romanticize so much of what's happening in Oaxaca. So there's like a couple factors. One is that as the mezcal industry is growing, like there's also popularity of like the state of Oaxaca. Then you also have like travel and leisure type of magazines and media that like are promoting Oaxaca as a top travel destination.
Mhm.
And so that's bringing in more floods. Then you layer this pandemic, and so people are like, where can I stretch my dollar? And
Mm,
they're just all flooding Mexico and Oaxaca, like Mexico City and Oaxaca. Um, so it's like all these things that are accumulating or like leading to tons of gentrification. And because we have not in the United States really learned to unlearn white supremacy values. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about white people, I'm talking about folks of color too, right? Because like we've been indoctrinated here to like think like a capitalist and to just watch out for ourselves and our be very individualistic. And so it gives us that entitlement to go to another country and either like start a business, which is really common in Oaxaca, or go there and just be inspired and pull pieces of the culture and sell it here in the United States or you know, other places. And it's basically perpetuates these social inequities that already exist, and in fact they are exacerbating it. I literally just 2 days ago, someone hit me up like, hey, I'm doing like a low fashion, like sustainable, da 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 da. Do you know people like who can be garment workers? I was like, what is your, like, I'm not even going to answer that. But people have that kind of audacity too, like just that entitlement of that they can go anywhere in the world and they're just like hunting for treasure, right? And like the more remote, the more rural, the better it is because it presents or it helps their brand paint a certain picture of that community or of that or of their product or service.
Can you speak to tourism specifically around mushrooms in Oaxaca?
I can speak from what I've heard from my experience. So I think it was like 2.5 years ago, I went to Valada de Jimenez, which is the pueblo where Maria Sabina was from. Maria Sabina is the Mazatec, not Mexican, Mazatec healer. And I went there with my mom. It was in August. It was like a month after, you know, her birthday. They do like big celebration there in July. And what some of the folks that I spoke to there were sharing is that people are going there and over harvesting mushrooms because it's seasonal. Everything is seasonal, right? And so what's happening is that they take it and it's for, you know, outsiders as consumption, and like the community doesn't have as much mushrooms and it's not growing the same ways that it used to, you know, before. And so that's one piece. The other piece is that, yeah, there are people who become guides. I don't know who or how they become guides. I actually don't have too much information about that. But we are seeing it here in the United States that people are become guides for like, you know, mushroom ceremonies. And my question with that always becomes like, there's a lot of healing that those communities, and including, you know, the communities that I belong to in Oaxaca, need. Like, where is the recognition and where is the respect that those communities deserve, right? Because a lot of and we see it just even in the ways that I've seen it so much on social media where people will say like, oh, Maria Sabina was a Mexican healer. It's like, no, give attribution. She's from Mexico, but Mexico is also a nation state. And I didn't touch on this earlier, but another reason why Oaxaca experiences so much poverty is because the nation state of Mexico has also marginalized and disenfranchised Oaxaca. And so like, no, I'm very much about let's be exact. If we can be exact, let's do that, because I mean, sometimes it's really simple. Like these things are really simple. All we have to do is think about like, how would it feel if we were like, oh yeah, you know, Ifatayo is like this American healer, just using that example, right? But no, it's the places that make you. So
yeah.
I want to say like, I am from Oaxaca, I'm from Matatlan, and LA is a big part of my identity and molded me because I was there for more than 20 years. And Oakland, the Bay Area, is also like something that, you know, a place that has influenced me. So I think that when we give people like more like place-based attribution, we're also honoring those lands. And I know that we're in this moment of like, let's acknowledge the land and rematriate and all this stuff. And there is a way to do that. And one of them is like, let's give it exactness and attribution where it is due and give thanks to those lands that also saw Maria Sabina be raised. Because I know that's how I feel about Matatlan. Like my love is primarily like the mountains that I ran and that I walked and that I played and that I like stood on, you know? So yeah.
No, it's important to, I mean, we also have to recognize that Mexico is a settler colony too, right? Like And, to your point, it's important to distinguish between someone being Mexican versus indigenous or both sometimes. So, yeah. Um, and you were getting into this a little bit. So, you know, I think it was 2020, I interviewed you for a piece that I wrote on Maria Sabina, that we shared on Maria Sabina Day, which is her birthday, July 22nd. And you talked about your experience of doing a Valada with your mom. And for those who don't know, Valada is a mushroom ceremony. And I mean, that's not something that people, everyone doesn't do mushrooms with their mom. So, and I know, like, obviously this is a part of your culture, but even then it's still not that common. So can you talk a little bit about, what motivated you guys to do it, and what were some of your learnings from it? Like, how was it as an experience, first of all, and then like afterwards, how did that change you, or did it change you? Did it change your relationship with your mother?
Yeah, that's I'm gonna try to keep it short, and I will also remind myself to speak slower. I feel like I have to start with my mom, who um, is a very pious woman and incredibly religious when we migrated. I didn't see that so much in Oaxaca, but when we came to the States, it was like church every single Sunday and a couple other times a week. So that's how we grew up. And it got to a point where she actually stopped practicing some of our tradition, like the cleansing with the egg, or like the limpias that we would do. And I definitely noticed that, and I felt like some grief around that because I like those elements of our culture. But when she went back, or when she was deported back, I think she remembered, like, oh yeah, this is part of our tradition. So she reintroduced it back into her life. So I'm really glad that she didn't fully disconnect. And I have a pretty like transparent relationship with my mom, and so I share a lot of things with her. And when I went back, it was with the intention to have a velada from me. And I
Mhm.
told my mom, I really need, like, I really want to do this, and I want you to come with me, because I had my little one who was 2 years at the time. And like when I do it, like I need someone to take care of Camilo, my child.
Mhm.
And so she was down, but she had her skepticism. She's like, well, why are you doing that? And like, isn't it dangerous? And like, I heard that you can like get stuck in that phase if like something goes wrong. And I had to like show her videos. I did a lot of education, personal education. I'm like, mom, she's from Oaxaca, she's from here, this is how they do it, this is the intention, and do all that. And then I guess she also talked to her comadres, and she's like, oh yeah, I did talk to my comadre, and apparently they've been using it too. So a lot of the usage is on like the low, because again, right, we don't really want to like share that we do these things because it's still stigmatized even in our own communities because of
Right.
Catholicism,
Mhm.
really. I mean, that's one of the reasons. Um, so anyways, we did end up going, and I won't get into the details, but I'll say that when we went, we were gonna do it. We didn't have anyone. I was like, no, we're gonna do this Oaxacan style. We're gonna go and we're gonna look for someone, because the idea of booking a ceremony just sounds really white to me. And I know it's like that's just the way a lot of folks need to do it these days. But if we're from Oaxaca, why not just do it like by word of mouth and like see who pops in our path.
Mhm.
Um, so we went. We talked to. There was a taxi driver who was sharing some experiences, and also a really Catholic person. And I think that gave my mom comfort, that it's something that's practiced in that community. That children do it when they're really young, and it's one of their healing modalities. And he recommended someone. So we went, and it was actually on the way to Maria Sabina's place, which is way up in the high mountains, like dirt road, like still in poverty, or still a lot of poverty. And what ended up happening is that the guide was like, it sounds to me like your mom needs this more than you do.
Yep.
So it ended up being like more for her. which I'm glad, I feel like there's, it also shifted our relationship a little bit. And so for me personally, it's actually given me like a different perspective of my mom that I didn't have before, both in positive or like in all kinds of ways. Um, and I'm still actually processing those things. Like I think that's something that I want to emphasize, that everyone's relationship and experience with mushrooms is going to be unique and different. And mine is like the processing is a lot slower. It's
Mhm.
not like you take it and then you're done and then you're healed, or the answer is there. Sometimes we're presented with more questions and more layers to that we need to peel. But that's my experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you mentioned that there was some Catholicism infused into the ceremony, which you kind of felt iffy about,
Yeah.
because that, the legacy of colonialism was obviously present.
Mhm.
And we see that in other cultures too, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, with Santeria, they have like the saints kind of camouflaging with the orishas, and yeah, it's a after effect of colonialism. um and I wanted to address one question that's in the Q&A, because I feel like it kind of relates to what we're going to get into next. And just for our audience, again, if you have questions, feel free to submit them. But our first question comes from Ismail Ali. Is there a way for local folks in Oaxaca or in general to benefit from increased interest in the local artisan industry? Is the answer simply stay out? What happens when that becomes impossible? Do folks sit back while their land and resources are used to make foreigners make money? How can we practically incentivize keeping the economic benefit from increased interest inside of a community so it doesn't become an inherently exploitive industry? It's a good question. And yeah, there's a lot there. So do you want to take the first stab at it?
Yeah, it's a multi-layered, multi-pronged type of response. And I know I definitely don't have the answers. I grapple with the same question too. Like, what does it look like what does it look like if people are going to be invited, or if people are still going to travel regardless? How can it still happen like equitably, or as equitably as possible and as respectfully as possible? One thing that comes to mind right now, right away, is like when I think of the Mezcal DO, the denomination of origin, is that it gave the entire state of Oaxaca the right to produce and call it Mezcal, which I think was a really wrong step. Why? Because out of like 570 municipalities, only about 140 or so actually are Mezcal producing communities. And so by giving the entire state um, the appellation, it's actually causing people who are not of mezcal producing communities to start producing mezcal. Why? Because incentive is money. It's the economic incentive. But what that's leading to is that towns that had a different, or like had um, towns that had relationships with other towns in more meaningful ways and more like around mutual care and mutual aid, don't
Mhm.
have that. Now they're competing with each other. And
Hmm.
so now what's being brought is like the values of capitalism. So, you know, I don't know. And I've kind of lost faith that politics and like policy is going to make, do the changes that we actually need. That is an area that I would address, that I think could. It shouldn't have been the entire state that got denomination of origin. I know people are just going to be like pissed about that because they want access to economic benefits as well.
Hmm.
I don't
Hmm.
know how to respond to that piece of it. But that's kind of where I stand. The other thing is like for people to also proactively reflect, like, is this really for me to just like get some profits, or like, what does it look like for me to also safeguard this tradition? And that means like the people, right? what does it mean to be on equal grounds and equal footing? Because I think a lot of times when we go to other countries, especially where there's like a lot of poverty, there is a savior complex. And we see it like there's like the really overt savior, right? Like the white person who just wants to save. And it's really blunt, but there's actually a lot of nuance. And I think a lot of people don't, it's harder when we like have to reflect and look at our own actions and realize, am I trying to save? And I have to ask myself that too. I'm like, as somebody who does have certain like privileges in education and language and like living in the US, am I trying to save people? Because I definitely don't want to do that. That's not my responsibility. But yeah, I do wonder like how people like what their relationship is with that. If they're going to build a business, like, is the business have shared ownership? Is there shared leadership? Are people, is there a shared language so that the decision making process is coming from a place of more equity? So I don't know, those are just some of the practical ones. Here in the United States, where I've seen like, I've heard of like folks who are not from Oaxaca, or particularly white folks who charge like hundreds of dollars for a mushroom ceremony, for example. My question is like, so how much of that time or what percentage of your services are going towards like Oaxacan folks or like indigenous folks and you know that need that healing but cannot afford the $500, $600, $1,000, whatever it is that they're charging, right? And how like there's got to be something that people give back. It can't just be like taking all the time. But yeah, I think those are the kind of questions that we can and should discuss more in community, because I don't have the answers, and like my answers may change like a month from now as I gather more information and more experiences in these worlds.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. No, it's Izzy says thank you for the answer. And yeah, it is a tough question because I think folks in the psychedelic space are starting to think about that too. And you know, when you mentioned earlier about having to migrate because of the industry, I wonder if that's going to be a thing happening, you know, as we see psychedelics like mushrooms or, you know, ayahuasca even become more popular, become more, I guess, more legal, decriminalized. How will, you know, American consumption, how will that impact, you know, folks further down the quote unquote supply chain? Yeah, yeah. And I know that you mentioned wanting to kind of take a harm reduction approach when it comes to folks moving down there or starting businesses. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's really linked to equity work. So like the way that I've been doing equity work for like 10 plus years. And what I've realized in those experiences that it's not liberation work, it's not freedom work. Not from me. That's not what it is. It's simply trying to get a little piece of that pie and still existing within institutions and systems, right? Like it's not, we know that these systems are designed a certain way. And it's more about how do we equip people so that they can also navigate it without like, I think that's the hard part, because I think that's something I reflect on. Like, can I say that I'm anti-capitalist and still teach or navigate myself these systems, right? And reclaim a portion of the economic wealth that is rightfully ours, especially when my culture is being appropriated, extracted, and stolen. Some of that money is ours. A lot of that money is ours. So I think that's when I think of harm reduction, it's more about that. And I've had to learn to separate like liberatory work, liberation work, and freedom work with like equity work. Equity work is paid work. I'm getting paid to think about how do we do this strategically, and what does it mean for us to like exist in these systems, right? And to like have a seat at the table, knowing that that table is really toxic and not really welcoming us, but still like claiming that we deserve a seat at this table. So that's what I think about. And it's hard. I think the other piece of that is actually, I'll pause there.
Okay.
Because you know, I'm checking our time, and I also wanted to ask you about the mushroom retreats in Jamaica.
Well, I've never been to one, that's for sure. Um, it's interesting because I think that a lot of people assume that like going to Jamaica is a vacation, and it's not. I don't. I'm kind of like you. Like when I visit my dad, I don't really do a lot of touristy things. I hardly even go to the beach. I learned very early on when I was a teenager, visiting Jamaica, going to Dunn's River Falls, which is a tourist attraction. It's a waterfall you walk up on. I realized very quickly how, Jamaicans are treated versus tourists. Um, and yeah, it was, it's very blatant, happens in front of your face. So, that said, I've heard a lot about different mushroom retreats in Jamaica, like Treasure Beach area. There is, I think, Myco Meditations is still around. I've heard about other ones popping up. Actually, not only mushrooms, I've heard of ketamine as well. And I think part of it, the part of the reason why they're popping up is because Jamaica doesn't really have laws against these particular substances, right? To my knowledge, there's not a Controlled Substances Act in Jamaica. And Jamaica is known for its cannabis, or as we say, ganja. So even that is technically, or it was for a long time, technically illegal, but it's not really enforced because it's so a part of the culture in Jamaica. And cannabis is funny because cannabis is so associated with Jamaica, but it's a lot of people don't know that it was Indian indentured servants who brought cannabis over in the late 19th century. When through British colonialism, they were brought after enslaved African folks were liberated. The British were like, okay, well, we need someone else to work for us for like dirt cheap or next to nothing. So they brought in Indian indentured servants. So just giving some context to Jamaica, because there's a lot of preconceived notions based on cultural exports, right, versus the reality. So like things like Rastafarianism are not always embraced in Jamaica. Like nowadays, folks are more open, but Rastas are actually looked down upon, discriminated against by police. There's been raids where they've been killed. So just giving folks some context. In terms of what do you call those things? The retreat, the retreats, I think I'm hesitant about those because, again, the tourist industry is corrupt. It is capitalist. It does not really help Jamaicans. I know a lot of people say like, oh, well, they're getting some money, we're supporting the local people, but most of the hotels, resorts are not owned by Jamaicans, right? If anything, we're getting chump change. And then you combine that with the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of enslavement. Most Jamaicans are not benefiting from the tourist economy in the ways that like we think, right? So with the retreats, I kind of feel like they're somewhat exploitative because there are people going there just to take advantage of the lack of laws around mushrooms, right? And they don't really have a cultural or ancestral connection to Jamaica. They just see it as a playground, right? With nice beaches, you got all the weed you can smoke, all the rum, all that stuff. And Jamaicans are just like their servants, their drivers or cooks, their cleaners, whatever. That's how I see it. I haven't seen a lot of retreats that are done by Jamaicans. I know there is one, and I'm forgetting their name, so I apologize. But I recently heard of a Jamaican guy doing mushroom retreats in Jamaica. But I would say to folks to, why do you need to go to Jamaica to do mushrooms? Like, you can do them here, even though they're illegal. You know, hey, don't you didn't hear that from me, but what it's kind of like this spiritual tourism thing almost. It's not quite the same, but it reminds me of like folks who, travel to India, and adopt like Indian spirituality, names, even the clothing. Yeah. And I just think that people need to be more intentional and question those kind of things more. And if you want to support Jamaicans, I think there are ways to do that. But also understanding that you're not making that much of an impact, right? We need structural change. You look at institutions like the IMF and all the things that they do around the world, they're like economic hitmen. When I think about Jamaica and its economic situation, I don't really foresee much changing in the future because, again, its legacy of colonialism and enslavement hasn't been reckoned with. And how do you expect basically an island plantation to thrive if we haven't received any type of reparations? Or yeah, it's just all kinds of messed up. And I don't think folks who are planning the retreat necessarily understand that when they're traveling down there. It's a vacation. And we as Americans, especially, we have to understand that like people live here. This is their home. We were able to understand why people get mad about gentrification in the US, but we can't understand what it means to go to someone else's country and treat the people with respect and dignity, and honor their history and their connections to the land there. So I could say a lot more. I'm very passionate about Jamaica and Jamaican, politics and things like that. So
thanks, Ife.
yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I see some of the comments coming in. Don just looked down because there's a lot of respectability in Jamaica, and that's colonialism. I've legit been refused entry to places because of the clothes I was wearing. There was actually a no sleeves law in Jamaica up until recently, where women in the workplace were expected to have sleeves on their shirts, even though it's hot as hell in Jamaica, year round. So that's just, that just goes to show that the legacy of colonialism is very, very strong. So yeah, there's a lot to say there. But I'll move on. I wanted to, before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to talk about, indigeneity and what it means to you, as someone who is Zapotec. And with that, what would you like to see change in Oaxaca, and not only Oaxaca, but like psychedelic discourse in general? Like I've noticed that, in the past 4 or 5 years, people in the psychedelic space are trying to be more intentional, more aware of inclusion, diversity, all those fun words, and talking about Indigenous people's connection to what we call psychedelics. And yeah, so I'm seeing a bit more effort from organizations and individuals, but what would you like to see change? Or how would you change the narrative that, you know, around Indigenous people and psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, I know.
um, I think I do want to start with like what it means to be Indigenous. I, I'm a very keep it real type of person, or I try to be. And I have to say that there's a part of me that's like really annoyed with like identity politics and this like sudden movement to like claim indigeneity or some racialized identity, right? Like we've talked about this, Ife. Like all of a sudden it's in to be of color, right?
Mhm.
And like the more of color we are, the more we think we can like just wave that identity card and say, you know, use it to sell our businesses, to sell, to get grants, money. I don't know, validation. I don't know why we're all doing it. And I also recognize that I'm part of that in the sense that like I do claim Zapotec because that's the language that my parents speak, that they both speak, that they spoke at home, and that they still speak.
Mhm.
And there are other cultural traditions and practices that are involved around that. So I do feel comfortable enough claiming Zapotec and Indigenous, I guess. However, if somebody from Oaxaca, especially if from my town, who was also born there and raised there and continues to live there, were to come up to me and tell me, you're not because you actually spend more time in the US, granted, not by choice, I'd be like, you're right. Nope, you're more indigenous than I am. Yep. And it's not about like, you know, more or less, but it's just something that I recognize. And I say this or bring this example up because I have also seen in the United States the same pattern of like so many folks claiming indigeneity and I my question's always like, what group, what people, what's tribe, but whatever the practices, which parent experienced what, you know, kind of thing. Like where's the experience, not just the name, um, and what is the tradition. So what I would like to see is more folks like recognize our privileges, right? Like I think for me it's more about like who are the people that um, can also claim indigeneity that could probably use more, like who can, you know, whose voices can and should be amplified. And that's what privilege is about, is like recognizing where we can like uplift others. So I would like to see more of that by people. And that actually that invitation is for like, at least for me, like Latinx folks, you know, just like, okay, you're Mexican, but like, do you know somebody who's from Oaxaca or even from like Huautla de Jimenez, from the Cañada region that maybe has more experience than you or more lived experience than you, who can also be part of the conversation and whose voices can be included in decision making.
Mhm.
The panels for sure, like the panels, they're so bad. I'm like, how do y'all not have like so much diversity and inclusion and yet they don't exist and they don't materialize.
Mm.
um yeah.
Mm.
And yeah, again, like giving attribution and more exactness, right? Like, you know, and this is not to say that like mushrooms originate from, I think there's like a question which we'll probably get to,
Mhm.
from Oaxaca, but it's more like if our teachers or folks as teachers are from there, if that's where they learned from it first, and like to just give credit where credit is due. It really
Mhm.
does go a long way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's so important because, you know, we live in this society where everyone wants to kind of make it seem like they made it on their own, or, um, you know, they just got this knowledge overnight. And, you know, that's not how it happened. And I think it's so important to recognize our teachers and recognize the places and the groups, where we got it from. And yeah, it kind of makes me think of how, you know, a lot of people will refer to like Africa as a country and not, you know, refer to the specific country or the specific ethnic group. And yeah, it is very important, because it's about respecting that person's background. So
Yes. I have this like I have the okay, so we're gonna get to Q&A right after this like question that I always love to ask Ife because it's so good. And I think that like we can have a whole other webinar, a whole other conversation around this. um, but I think it was especially like a couple years ago when like there was a lot of protests happening that people were like, there was like a sign that you posted of this person carrying like the person carrying a sign that said like everyone or cops should do ayahuasca.
Yeah.
And I rolled my eyes, but you posted about that, and
Mm.
I'm curious, like, why is psychedelics not the silver bullet to like racism or white supremacy and capitalism? Because people
Oh,
like they should all just do psychedelics.
so funny. No, it's not funny, but I'm laughing because I'm not going to say who, but someone already said, like, please, no one say that, Russia and the Ukraine need psychedelics. But I'm like, I've already heard someone say that. So terrible, terrible, terrible. But yeah, I think that there's this notion in the psychedelic space that, if everyone just took psychedelics, then the world would be a better place. And I wish it were that simple. But also like, you're just high, like, stop. Um so it, there's also this notion that, like, oh, psychedelics make you a better person. And I think it can, sure, but it's not always that simple. It's more nuanced than that. And I kind of see what's happening now with psychedelics, as people kind of being like, oh, well, this will solve all of our mental health problems. Like, fuck Prozac, we got mushrooms now. Like, there's that attitude, and it's like we're integrating these substances into a burning house. I think that's what Martin Luther King said when he was talking about integration back in the 60s. But I kind of see it applying here too. Like, we have these substances that have a culture attached to them, and a lot of folks aren't really acknowledging that. But also, we cannot take shortcuts to making the world a better place. If it was as easy as taking psychedelics, we all would have taken psychedelics by now. But what we need is structural change. Like, you cannot skip around that. We need a world that we're having a $70 billion defense budget is ridiculous, right? And we need leaders who understand that it's ridiculous. We live in a world where war is profitable, whether it be the war happening now, or that has been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, the one that's about to pop off in Ukraine, the war on drugs. Like, it's profitable. And if we can't change these systems that incentivize it, then psychedelics aren't really they're just gonna, I guess, open another can of worms, right? And that's not to discount the personal development and healing that people get from psychedelics, because obviously most people in this room who are in this who are in this webinar right now have benefited in some way from psychedelics, probably, or want to learn how to benefit from it. But we also have to think a little bigger than that. We have to understand that right now a lot of our healing modalities are based on the individual, and we need to start looking at healing as a communal project. Because I can get all the healing services that I want, but if someone like my dad, who's been to prison and deported, can't, then how does that really heal me, right? Because part of what caused me trauma growing up was my father going to prison. So, these type of things affect everyone in the community. I always say that when you send one person to prison, you also send their family and their community. So we have to figure out ways to heal on a larger scale and not just individualism. And that starts with us caring about each other. When COVID first started, we saw a surge in mutual aid. We saw, people trying to be more considerate of other people, having to negotiate oh, can I go see my family because I may have COVID? We didn't have the rapid test back then. And that was the first time that I saw in the US on a large scale, people really trying to look out for each other's. Of course, times have changed and a bunch of things have happened since March 2020. But I don't think psychedelics will be a panacea for the world until we start to work and organize to change the systems in conjunction with bringing psychedelics into the mainstream or the world or whatever. So yeah, that's my answer. We can go to Q&A now. I know we got a lot of good questions in here. Fabiola, I don't know if you have a preference on one you want to answer first. I can just go down the list.
You can go down the list. I haven't actually really checked.
Okay. This first one's not exactly a question. Okay.
Good point, though.
Okay, let's go to Della Moran's question. Does psilocybin cultural use come from other places? Oh, we kind of answered that. But yes, it does. It does. Yeah, I'm forgetting the researcher's name, but there's mushrooms, psilocybin, and other hallucinogenic mushrooms have existed all over the world. And I believe there's like a lot of research on like ancient uses of entheogens, including mushrooms. Next question. What are your thoughts on the Black community and the way that legalization is played out in some states? What does accountability and restorative justice look like for the cannabis community? How do you see this playing out with the resurgence, mainstream utilization of psilocybin in the USA, parallels, differences? It's a good question. And Fabiola, I know you can't speak to the Black community, but you can speak to your community. So I don't know if you want to take a stab first, or I can take a stab.
I'll just say quickly, the word accountability is what stands out for me. And I think one of the things that I would like my communities to be more aware of is when we are being anti-Black, and the ways that like understanding, right, that like laws and policies are written in a way so that we actually like, they're inherently anti-Black, as I mentioned earlier. And what does it mean to like undo and unlearn those things? I don't know. I think it's more about like, when I think seeing this question, like I also want us to reflect on what is our part as non-Black people, or for non-Black people of color specifically, to also be in solidarity with Black folks, right? And that is true with immigration as well, right? Because it actually affects Black folks more than like brown or like other non-Black folks. More to say, but I want to hear your response more.
Yeah, I would say with legalization, I think that, folks are being more conscious and trying to include equity when it's written in bills. I think that it's been a struggle and, and it's taken some time, for people to get it right. I remember when I first started working at DPA, we were doing Prop 64 in California. That was in 2016, and that's the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. And I know a lot of Californians were not happy about that. And I know some of the equity stuff that was supposed to happen did not happen in the ways that we expected. So we still have a lot of work to do. And, when it comes to accountability, restorative justice, I think that, the cannabis community, the cannabis industry needs to be more transparent about, of course, the money, also hiring practices. I know that the industry's building more and more jobs. But I think we definitely, like the industry, in my opinion, needs to do more. Well, no, I don't want to say do more, but there needs to be more of an acknowledgement around, people whose lives were stolen through cannabis prohibition. And, it's still happening. I'm from South Carolina, where people are still getting arrested for cannabis and other drugs. Places like Louisiana have like some of the highest rates of incarceration and also the highest concentration of Black people in this country. So we have a duty to, you know, work to liberate those folks as well, work to go to places that we see as scary or like, you know, unchangeable or backwards, right? Places like where I'm from. And how do I see this playing out with the resurgence of psilocybin in the US? Are there parallels? Are there differences? I definitely think there are parallels. I mean, I can't keep up with all the for-profit psychedelic companies popping up. I really can't. There's so many, and I can't. It feels like it's happened overnight, even though it didn't. But I think a lot of us in the community are just like, whoa, like what do we do? Because this it's almost like we're too late as it is. And I don't want to say that because I don't want people to like give up, but these people have a lot of power and money. So I see a lot of parallels in terms of like a lot of companies being owned by the more privileged people. Will there be differences? Will we do it differently than like what was done with Colorado and Washington back in like 2012? I hope so. But I think it's about people like us trying to get a foot in the door and in different spaces that are being formed, community groups, and learning how to do like advocacy, lobbying, that kind of thing, because that is what's going to get our voices heard. So yeah. Next question, what are ways, resources that people can learn about Indigenous practices of psychedelics to be more informed?
That's a tough one. So a lot of our like traditions or like our ways of being are not written. Like it's a practice, right? And that's both like there's pros and cons. Like on the pro side, like it's only accessible if you are of the community. And on the con side, we don't have the evidence. So actually, I think that's where I'm like, where's the people that care? Like say, oh, I love Oaxaca, I love Mezcal, I love, Maria Sabina, going down there and or like coming up with the funding to document these practices so that it stays and it continues to live within the community.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I think of, yeah, I mean, I think that's the one thing that I push forward a lot is like when we say that we love a culture, how are we being of service to the people who are of that culture, right? And not like just grabbing a part of the culture and packaging it into a product or a service, but actually being of service to people. Where that means like you give, like you find the resources that you need and actually, ask the community, like, do they want to document this? Do they want a library of these practices? Like, is this something that, what can be taught and what should be handed down to younger generations? Because there's a gap there and people I don't know, that's just one response that comes to mind right now.
Yeah.
Answers it.
Yeah. I think just throwing another resource out there, Sharkruna, which is Bielabate's platform, they do a lot of work with Indigenous groups in South America. So like if you're looking for like reading material, that would be a good, they have a lot of articles on their website. But yeah, definitely echoing what you said, Fabiola, is like, examine that relationship and just carrying that self-awareness.
What's the name of the org that you just mentioned? Or can you type it in so folks?
Oh yeah, I'll type it in for everyone. All right. Next question from Carmen. Are there ways to participate in ceremonies where outsiders are invited with intentions of healing while at the same time respecting and honoring the community? And And there's more, but I'll stop there and then we can continue with the rest of the question.
I don't know of any. And as I mentioned at the beginning, like I'm not in the industry per se. I have had experiences as a Oaxaqueña, but I don't know. I think this is where like relationship building comes to mind, which is like Carmen, a like I mean, and this is also more of like an ideal and a dream. I'm like, it would be so cool to just travel to places where I'm invited. But that means I have to actually make relationships with people, create relationships with people of those countries, right? Because that's how we get access, like authentic and more real access to those places. Um, that's like the only thing that comes to mind. Um, yeah, I don't know enough about the community because I'm not from Huatla de Jimenez. And there's also other communities in Oaxaca. I shouldn't just say it's Huatla de Jimenez, but yeah, I think this is also where we get to practice, like, does this feel good or not? Like check in with people's intuition, with your own intuition and see if it feels good. And sometimes like it may not be the best, but like if it's an option and like there's a craving to have a healing ceremony around something, then like those are just the conditions that we can live in or that we live in. And at the same time, like we shouldn't be taking like sole responsibility for like the absence of like better uh traveling practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think that folks need to necessarily travel outside the US to, engage in ceremony. I've been in ceremonies with, led by Indigenous folks in right here in New York. So I think like you said, relationship building, but also Carmen, to your question about how does one access them and find out. Well,
Yeah.
part of the reason why it's hard to access them is because prohibition, and a lot of it's like a word of mouth thing, and people don't want to put themselves at risk by doing this. So I would suggest, like, if you're trying to find somewhere in your community where people are giving back to the community, word of mouth is usually the best, in my opinion, the best way to find it. Just like plug into um your local community. But yeah, I definitely hear about the capitalistic approaches, but I would say there are some groups out there that aren't really about that, but you may have to do some digging. Next question from Courtney Watson. Do y'all think folks running these programs actually care about the impact of spiritual tourism on the local community? How do we hold them to the fire for their impact? Whew, that's a good one. do we I assume programs meaning like, ceremonies, but also other forms of spiritual tourism. Do I do I think so? Honestly, short answer, no. But I think that a lot of people get stuck on intent of something. Like, oh, well, they didn't intend to impact the local community poorly, but intent does not always equal impact, right? So I think bringing that awareness of their impact to them, and a lot of times they won't react well to that. Obviously, no one likes being held to the fire. But I think that's the start of the conversation, talking about the impact. And I think a lot of people running these programs are ignorant or may see what they're doing as positive, and they're like, oh, well, we're doing good. Like everyone who we interact with is good, right? People have tunnel vision. So that's what I think of when yeah.
Yeah, I don't actually. So one thing that I've learned the hard way is that accountability is like something that we commit to as like we can't force anyone to be accountable,
Mhm.
period. As much as we want people to like be held accountable, it just doesn't happen. And we see it like all the time in the news with cops, especially, right? So I think I personally don't even like put my energy or any of my energy towards holding people accountable who don't even see that there's a problem. Learned that the hard way though, sadly.
How did you learn that the hard way?
I think just want like I think when I have experienced harm, like really wanting people to do better and really wanting people to like take ownership of the ways that they harmed me, and them just like really not being ready to own it or like denying it, blatantly denying it. And like that actually has caused me more like and yeah, more angst and just frustration. And then it's a lost cause. And that's the work, that's where the work is for me. Like, how do I still coexist with people who have caused me harm, and not let it like bog me down? It's same thing with these folks. Like they're going to continue to exist, these types of organizations and people. um, I think like if we can get out of their way so that we're not harmed by them, that in itself could be a win. So
Mhm.
maybe partially like reframing it, but it's a hard one.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I want to go to this question in the comments from Sabrina. Any tips for how to vet a NGO or nonprofit? I've seen virtue signaling a lot in the mezcal industry, like a portion of the proceeds goes towards X organization, or we are investing in sustainability by replanting agave, when we know that it's not helping reforestation, community development, or the issue of monocropping. That's a really good question.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of these orgs, and replanting agaves is not enough. That is actually the a baseline. It should be a baseline obligation. Of course, you have to replant agaves. Like you're using up the resources. You should be planting like more than three, because I think a lot of them will say like, we replant 3 agaves for everyone that we use. Like, okay, and you want a cookie or like, what do you want? And I think like as consumers, what we need to do is actually become educated about like the things that we consume. Like, where is this coming from? How long does it take for it to grow? Where is it growing from? It's really difficult because by the time a product reaches your hands or your tables, like that information is missing, right? And so unless you are actually in connection with the families or the producers or the community that produces, it's really hard to track it. And we also don't know where that money, even with the NGOs, like where they're going,
Hmm.
and if it's staying within the organization, if it's actually being distributed back. So I feel like there is a need to have like this list of like, because the other thing that I get hit up about a lot is like, oh, which brands do you recommend? And my response is always like, just because we purchase a certain brand doesn't mean that we can absolve ourselves of like a social responsibility, or like that shouldn't make us feel good. It's more about, why are you consuming it? What purposes are you consuming it for? And like, what does it mean to you, right? Like yeah, because I think people are becoming like collectors of mezcal, and they want all the bottles, and they want to be the connoisseur, and they want to like know all about it because it's hip, because it's in, because there's money, because it's like an industry now. And the question for me is becomes why, um, and also understanding the impact that it has on the community. Like when people who are producing it are no longer able to afford it for their own practices and traditions, where's the ethics in there? And that's why, like I've said, like there's nothing ethical. There's no such thing as like ethical, sustainable, like responsible tourism and
Yeah.
consumerism by extension. And again, it's not to take the blame. It's not to like shame ourselves and like don't drink water, don't eat food, because everything is like pretty. It's been stained by capitalism. Period. So it's more about like maybe being more mindful of the quantities. But sure, yes, the way that I tend to I get mezcal from people that I know and that I'm building relationship with. Um, and so that first for me is like they have to be producer owned,
Mm-hmm.
family owned, and hopefully like use traditional practices, because a lot of people are foregoing traditional practices, and they distill year round, and they use like really young agaves when they shouldn't. Yeah, there's just like there's a lot to cover, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think you made some good points about the disconnect. There's Karen in the comments, she said she's a dietitian and there is a disconnect from our food, which is true. There's a disconnect from so many things, like the clothes we wear. We don't think about the people in the factories who sew our clothes, and the people who pick our food. So in a way, that's kind of disempowered us from being able to make those choices. Um, and there's a question from Jillian about the Kardashian, was there a Kardashian
Yeah.
mezcal brand?
Yeah, there's the Kendall Jenner has a tequila brand, the 818, and everybody was up in arms about it. I
Uh,
mean, I've said this before, and the celebrity brands don't shock me anymore. Like, of course they're gonna do that. That's their job, is to like hoard money and resources. I'm not shocked, and I don't actually get mad because it's a waste of my energy. What I do get upset about is when other people with a marginalized identity start doing the same thing, like doing the same behaviors that celebrities do, which is go to a place, or go to Oaxaca, get some producers, get their brand, and then we come here to the U.S. and market it as like, this is a woman-owned brand. My
mhm.
question is like, but is this woman from the country, from like the place, from this culture, or are we just like celebrating like identity for the sake of celebrating it without like the critical consciousness and the critical lens that we need so that we can do the accountability work? So much of that, like I cannot, there's like a solid list of women-owned brands of color who get celebrated because they have a brand, and sure, congratulations for making it into like capitalism. At the same time, the practices that they use are actually really harmful, and sometimes they're really fucked up and really like anti-indigenous, and these are based on like true stories and um experiences that I've heard from other folks living there. So to me,
Mhm.
that's not enough that it's like woman-owned brand.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think, now with you saying this, especially about like the anti-indigenous practices, I think that folks in the psychedelic world could stand to learn a lot from, you, but also just seeing how mezcal has transformed because of these industries being built. I see just a lot of parallels between mezcal and psilocybin, ayahuasca, um, iboga, all those things.
Yeah.
I know it's 9:30 Eastern time, so I know that we're slated to end soon, but I wanted to see if we have time for another question or two before we wrap up.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, cool. So let's see, Bianca Bryant asks, how can we develop communal healing spaces as we struggle with the legalization of psychedelics?
I'm gonna let you take that one because I feel like you have more experience there.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, right, we're kind of building the cars, we're driving it. And I think people who want to build healing spaces for like psychedelic healing spaces could learn a lot from harm reduction workers and the harm reduction movement, um, and see how they've been, creating their own spaces despite the, how a lot of the harm reduction practices have been criminalized or illegal. So like sterile syringes in some states are illegal. Handing out harm reduction supplies are illegal. We had that whole thing in the news cycle about the free crack pipes, even though that was like totally not what was happening. But folks in the harm reduction world have been creating their own spaces to, save people's lives from poison drug supply, overdose for a few decades now. Handing out naloxone, even though the government could be doing all this, should be doing all this because they have the money. The safe consumption site that, became legal in New York recently has saved, a few hundred lives already, and it's only been around for like a few months. But those sites existed before it was officially legal to do, right? And there are also psychedelic healing spaces that exist as well, underground, despite the law. So those people are already doing the work. So I would say, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We can look at what's already been done, what's already happening. And then, of course, educating and building power to get, substances legalized and decriminalized. Like I said, building the car while we're driving it. So if we're going to have thriving communal healing spaces, we also have to think about how the policies are being written to support those healing spaces. I think a lot of people have this understanding that, like, oh, if we legalize, mushrooms, for example, then it's all going to be corporate owned, it's going to be monopolized, and it doesn't have to be that way. Like, we can build enough power to dictate how we want these substances to be treated in our community, whether it be home grow, co-op. There's all kinds of models out there for us to think through and implement. So,
given people's powerful healing experiences with psychedelics, which inspired them to be enthusiastic, how do we educate these folks convincingly that psychedelics are not the panacea that they believe them to be? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm like, I don't know. People just need to. Sometimes I feel like you either get it or you don't, and I know that's like coming from a place of exhaustion and like cynicism. But yeah. Do you have a response for that, Ife?
Well, I think part of it is recognizing, if you're in like community with these folks, right? Kind of giving them a reality check. Because there's lots of research done on why, like, psychedelics aren't the panacea or could support that argument. I know that some folks from Symposia wrote a piece about like psychedelics and right-wing fascists. So obviously there's people like that taking psychedelics who aren't turning into better people. And I think the term that's relevant for here is psychedelic exceptionalism, treating psychedelics as if they're a better class of drugs than other drugs. And I guess this is one example. Why would psychedelics be a panacea as opposed to other drugs? Again, no drug is a panacea. Like, you can take psychedelics and have a bad experience and learn nothing from it, and that's okay. But like I said before, we need structural change. We need to change the systems that we live in, and psychedelics can be a tool to help us imagine what those new systems or the new infrastructure looks like. But they're a tool, and there's lots of tools in the toolbox, and psychedelics aren't for everyone. There's some people who can't take psychedelics safely. There's some people who don't want to take psychedelics, and that's totally okay. So understanding, I guess, kind of framing it as, okay, psychedelics can be part of the solution, but they're not the end all be all solution. Nothing is. There will never be one thing that is like the end all be all solution, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. This question by Nachisa, I'm sorry, I'm so butchering that. I apologize.
Oh, Nachisa, yeah.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting question. Are there any notable studies focused on communities of color and lower economic class subjects? I don't. And I think that's really interesting because I want to guess here that the findings would be different because of the stigma, right? Because of the fear, especially for like immigrants and undocumented immigrants who are like scared of taking drugs because it does pose a deportation risk. or it does, if they have a job, like they could lose their job. Like there's a lot at risk for those of us who are not, or for folks who are not documented to be part of these studies. And there's mistrust between obviously the government, but also with like research institutions who have caused a lot of damage. So I think that would be interesting to learn though, because I do see that a lot of the research is centered around white folks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dr. Monica Williams has done some research on it, but I don't know if that has been completed or what. But I know that she's a Black woman researcher, and she was doing some work around racial trauma. But I can't speak to the specifics of, the outcomes of her research. So yeah, I agree. It would be interesting to see, but I do have hope that there will be more research regarding our communities.
I do want to take Carmen's question real quick. I mean, we're just going to go through all the questions. People seem to be staying, so folks are welcome to leave. You're going to get the recording anyway. We appreciate your presence.
Let's do these two. Yeah.
So Carmen asked, what if people claiming their ancestry aren't able to fully claim it as a result of colonization and revisioned history, and they don't have access to because it's been stripped away? I think that's a question that a lot of folks, it's a reality for a lot of folks. I think that there is a way to respectfully reconnect. And I've actually, for myself, even like trying to move away from saying like I'm Zapotec or like Indigenous to like saying like of Zapotec descent, because my Zapotec, like the language itself, I'm a novice, like I understand everything my parents say, but like I can't speak it as fluidly and fluently as my parents can. So I personally would kind of want to make that want to distinguish that. And I also know that there's like, I mean, within the context of Oaxaca, folks who, because of the anti-indigeneity, like just kind of like put that, because of colonialism, that part of like that family's history away. So there's a lot of folks in that situation, actually. I guess this is where I would say like things like really doing like this spiritual work or like that ancestral healing work could be one option or one way to reconnect. I don't know what everyone's spiritual like life is like and belief systems are, but I do believe that there is a way to reconnect with our ancestors spiritually. Reading has also helped, like really learning like, oh snap, like Zapotec people were like mathematicians and innovators and artists and scientists and all this stuff. And like really, it also like helped me see myself in a different light. So doing that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's also like, for me, understanding like both the spectrum of my identity, which means like, yes, both of my parents are from Oaxaca, I speak Zapotec, and that there was Spanish influence and colonialism. And so some of that stayed. And sometimes like there are, as I like to say, oh shit, like the white ancestors are coming through. Right. And recognizing that we're not 100% indigenous, like there's no such thing as that. And definitely like these tests, DNA tests that people do around ancestry, like bullshit. So I don't know, those are just my opinions about indigeneity and identity.
Yeah. And last question from Satu. Usually the people who have the money are the ones who initiate legalization to criminalize those without money in order to corner the markets. Should we be thinking about working collectively to deal with this reality? Ooh, that's a good question.
I want to say that I hope and feel that the underground economy will always exist. I think sometimes I become overwhelmed with like legalization and like formalizations and regulations around like all of these substances that we're talking about here today. And while there is equity work to be done and systems change to do, there's also the very alive underground economy where we can continue to exist without so much regulation, without so much restriction. And for me personally, it's more about like, I don't know if it's about changing the entire system. I mean, definitely, I think that's like the work that a lot of folks are doing, but it's also about like, how do we also keep the underground economy alive? I don't know if that's permissible in this. There's just like people are gonna find a way, you know. I
Yeah.
think there's resilience in that, there's creativity in that, and that should be celebrated.
Yeah. But the underground market is how a lot of folks, found jobs or were able to access healing. And I know for me growing up, like that's how I was able to get resources sometimes was, talking to people who had the hookup. That's how we say it. So yeah, I agree. I think that this is a interesting question, but I know that policy folks, like in the drug policy and reform work, are thinking about how do we integrate people from the underground market into, like, I guess, the mainstream market. But I think what Satu's question brings up is like, well, do those people want to be integrated into that mainstream market? And like maybe that just happens on its own, or who knows. So yeah, it's hard to say because we still haven't seen we're still seeing how things play out.
Can I add really quickly to that?
Mhm.
So what comes to mind too is also working like across silos, because I think a lot of times we're siloed. So like, you know, when there is a business that, like, let's just take like a cannabis business as an example, like who are the like nonprofits or like the community-based organizations that they're partnering with, who maybe are working with like system involved folks, you know, and trying to get them, you know, working on reentry programs, and like that being a funnel for employment, right? Like what is the connection between businesses, community-based organizations, and social justice? Because a lot of times we just like stick within our little lanes, and that's what exactly what, you know, these systems are designed
Mm.
for, is to keep us in our lane and not like talk to each other.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what the question kind of gets to, is like working collectively across silos, across disciplines and industries, and being more creative and expanded in our thinking around these things. Um, did you have anything you want to add in terms of like a call to action or final thoughts before you wrap up?
I was actually just going to share this article that talks a little bit more about Maria Sabina's role in her life. Like, it's pretty sad because, like, you know, she's celebrated here in the US within like the psychedelics community, but like she
Mhm.
wasn't like really favorable to her townspeople, right? And just something to really to sit with, and also just how like she didn't have agency, there was no consent around
Mm.
the velada. So, you know, for folks who are a little bit more interested in that, and it speaks to her Mazatec identity. So
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, it's super important to look at the history there, to help us, know where to go in the future.
yeah, and then I guess I'm just going to reiterate like some of like the things that I listed today, which is like, you know, if they're going to be there's panels that are going to be hosted, like, is it really representative of the people and the cultures who, you know, is whose culture is being talked about? That goes for cannabis, mezcal, and mushrooms as well. Yeah, for white practitioners, like giving credit where credit is due, um, allocating a percent of their services for like BIPOC folks who really do need those services. And yeah, charge your white, you know, affluent, charge them. Um, Yeah, I think that's all I'll add right now.
Yeah. Overall, just more awareness, when moving in these spaces and in these industries. And oh, I will let me share the article again because I don't think everyone got it.
Oh,
No worries. I think it was you sent it to the host and the panelists. So everyone should have the article now. It's
yeah.
timeline.com. So thank you all for joining us on this Thursday evening. If you like to stay in touch with us and our work, you can visit www.pocpc.org. We are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and you can also follow Fabiola on Instagram and Twitter. Her username is Wahak the Talk, and feel free to connect with her over email, wahakthetalk@gmail.com. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Feel free to stay in touch. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you all.